Genesis chapter 6, look at verse number 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Brother Michael, can you just turn me down a little bit on the soundboard so it's not echoing all over the place? But I want to emphasize some things that we left off on a couple weeks ago, and it starts with that word grace. Somebody give me a quick definition of grace. Oh, I didn't think I was going to start off with a quiz. Surprise. All right. Undeserved favor, unmerited favor, you not deserving the blessing of God, but getting it anyway. That is definitely the meaning. That is definitely the usage. However, in the Old Testament, you do kind of see a slight difference of like completely unmerited favor. Now, was there anything that you have done or had done before you got saved to deserve God's gift of salvation by grace through faith? Absolutely not. You're completely unworthy. You're a wretched sinner, alienated from God. Just, it's a complete work of absolute mercy and grace. But look what that first word in verse number 8 is at. See that word but? What does that suggest? That word is indicating a contrast between Noah and all of the horrific things that were being done in the first 7 verses. And we talked about those in great detail. I'm not going to rehash them. And so you almost get the idea here that Noah, to some degree, stands out in God's eyes because of his character. And you actually see this explicitly stated in the very next verse. Look at verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was, number 1, a just man, and number 2, he was perfect in his generations, and number 3, he walked with God. Okay? He is very much different than the other people in the world at that time. Now, what's interesting about this in verse number 9, it says that he was a just man and perfect. Does that word perfect anywhere in the Bible suggest sinlessly perfect? No, it doesn't. And the reason that that even becomes a thing that I have to say is because there were holiness Christians through the years that taught that you, if you're truly saved, will live a sinless life. And somebody give me a quick idea where they might get that idea from, or how they would arrive at that conclusion that you can live a sinless life as a Christian. They're confusing something. So, think about it. We've talked about this. Remember, go back in your mind to 1 John when we studied that book that has an emphasis on the division between your, yes, bingo, say it again, your standing and your state. So remember, your position in Christ is 100% sinless. You are in Jesus Christ positionally. Your standing before God is not as a stranger, it is as a sinless son, because you are in Jesus Christ and you have the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ. So you will never go to hell. You will never be separated from the love of God. You are in Christ sinless. That's your position. But in your practice, the state of your Christian life, not sinless at all. So that's where that false teaching comes from. It comes from the failure to divide between your standing and your state. Okay? But this word perfect in the Bible, although it never means sinless, it's used 94 times in the Bible, and it always generally means complete or mature in whatever the subject matter is where that word perfect appears. Okay? It's never necessarily a reference to sinless perfection. It's always in the context of its usage. Go to Luke chapter 1. Now, the word perfect is not going to show up here, but there's another word, blameless, that is. And I want you to understand this. Luke chapter 1, verse number 6. It's speaking about the parents of John the Baptist. And it says, and they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. Does that mean that they never sinned? No, it doesn't. Then how can they stand before God blameless? Just read it. Just read the context. What have they done? They've been walking in the commandments and ordinances of God. They've been keeping the Old Testament law. And they've been keeping it as faithfully as they can be, and they are blameless, or they're perfect in regard to that specific thing. Okay? Look at Philippians chapter 3. To be perfect is to be blameless in doing what God commands you to do in the immediate context of the word's usage. That's really what it comes down to. Philippians chapter 3, look at verse number 6. Now, this is Paul giving his testimony of before he was saved. He says he's giving his testimony as a Pharisee. You see that at the end of verse number 5. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Blameless, meaning he had kept that Old Testament law as good as anybody ever could, such that no one could ever really point their finger of accusation at him and call him a sinner or a heathen or anything like that. He was perfect in that thing. And so what's the immediate context of this verse where Noah is called perfect? It's not participating in all the deviancy and the sexual immorality and the violence and the corruption that is being condemned in Genesis chapter 6. He stayed away from it. So actually, as long as you're in Philippians chapter 3, look at verses 14 and 15. I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect, be thus minded. And if anything ye be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. So we are called to perfection. You are called to be perfect, but that doesn't mean sinless. You understand? It means that we are to be faithful and as complete as we can be in the things that God has called us to do, just like Noah was. All right, now go back to Genesis, and we'll look at a couple. Well, actually, I want to keep going in chapter 6 here. So look at verse 10. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And they're always mentioned in this order. We actually saw them listed at the very end of chapter 5, verse number 32, where it says Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You're going to see them again throughout here, these next few chapters, including in chapter 10, verse number 1, where you're going to see them listed again, and then their genealogies are going to be given. All right, so they're kind of singled out. These 3 men and their wives are the only people that Noah's ministry, the only fruit that Noah has to his ministry. He preaches for 120 years, and the only people he can convince that is true is his own family. His wife, daughters-in-laws, and daughter. That's it. Now look at verse 11 and 12. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Notice it doesn't say all men have corrupted their way upon the earth. It says all flesh, because of what we talked about previously. Those angels that left their first estate, they took on flesh. So they're fallen angels that were cohabitating with those women. They're not necessarily men, but God says that they are like men and they will die like men. They've taken on flesh. They've been corrupted. So everything in the world at this point is corrupt. And you'll remember also that we were talking about, maybe not in great detail, and I still don't want to go into great detail because it's just so filthy and disgusting, that animals had also been contaminated by some of the vile practices that were going on in the world, and that's why they do not escape the judgment of God. They're all destroyed as well, too. Everything. Everything's going to be destroyed. All flesh. That's fallen angels, men, animals. All flesh. That kind of destroys the argument that there was a godly line of Seth, doesn't it? If all flesh had been corrupted and only one man is singled out for salvation. Verse 13. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. There's that word again. It was singled out in verse number 11, singled out again in verse number 13 as one of the attributes of the corruption of the world. It was extremely violent. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So the two major corrupt characteristics of this chapter are unlawful cohabitation, right? Sexual immorality in verses 2 through 4, and violence here in verse number 13. And that's exactly the way it is right now today. All right? You are living in a world of complete debauchery. And those two things, immorality and violence, are very much linked together. Some of the most debauched, wicked, vile, violent kings of history, from Caligula to many others, were extremely deplorable in their uh, sexual behaviors. These two, it has the corrupting influence of the heart is not specific to that one area. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. And the more desensitized a person becomes to humanity, the more vile they become in their treatment of others. And it manifests itself not just in great immorality, but in great violence. How is it that some of these rulers and some of these people that led these torture chambers and these execution halls, and think about the way that certain people were executed through the Middle Ages and then the Dark Ages. They didn't just take them out back and shoot them in the back of the head. They stretched them on racks. They impaled them. They just all kinds of different types of torturous things. They made people suffer for hours and hours and days before they killed them. Why would a person do that exactly? It's so wicked and so evil. That's what's going on in that day. Now, look in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 24. Excuse me, Matthew chapter 24, verse number 37. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now watch verse 40. Then shall two be in the field, one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, and the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. Now look, all of Matthew chapter 24 is tribulation, second coming of Christ, but that passage right there, you can 100% take it to the bank. You can make a spiritual application to your life before the rapture. That is exactly the same moral characteristics of Noah's day are what it's going to be like in the tribulation. And you see, all of those things expanding and taking hold today in preparation for the Antichrist's rule. All right? As bad as you think it is now, you're just seeing the seedlings break through the soil of the plants that will come full bloom in the tribulation period in regard to the absolute wickedness of society and humanity. I mean, it's literally just in its infancy of where it's going. Look at this thing also. Two shall be in the field, one shall be taken and the other left. What time of day is that? Daytime. All right. Two women shall be grinding at the mill. The one shall be taken and the other left. And there's a cross reference I want to give you that I thought was in the passage. It's not. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Let me check Luke's account. 17, 26. No, I don't have it. I thought there was a reference in there to two lying in a bed, one being taken and one being left. Is that in one of the other Gospels? Or is it just in the same passage and I'm just missing it? And the reason I'm even saying that, again, is because... What's it say? Can you read it? Bingo. All right, so stop right there. That was Luke 17:34, right? Right? So if these people are working in the middle of the day, what are those other two people laying in bed for? Nighttime. Opposite sides of the world at the same time. Understand it's nighttime right here, but it's daytime in Australia. Right? So what you're seeing there is a global rapture. Okay? It's daytime on this side of the world and it's nighttime on the other. But we didn't discover the world was round until when? 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue? No, God had that thing laid out in the Bible many, many, many years before modern science discovered it. You understand? So anyway, while we're there, I just thought I'd point that out to you. But pay attention. Don't miss the moral lesson there, right? Is that you're just going to be going about your day one day, you're going to be driving to work, and then that trumpet's going to blow, and boom, you're gone. And anything that you thought you had time to do, you don't have any time anymore. You're gone, right? And that car is going to be, I saw a bumper sticker one time that said, in case of rapture, car will be pilotless. And I was like, praise the Lord. If you can read that sticker on the at the rapture, then you're on the right side of it. You know, don't be in front of it, but you're probably safe behind it. But anyway, get done what you need to get done and get ready. Because I'm telling you, you're going to be out of here real soon. Real soon. All right. Back to Genesis chapter 6, verse number 13. I'm not preaching on that necessarily, but that's what this is all pointing to. I'm going to emphasize violence here for a second, because I think that's one thing that Christians tend to tolerate in their lives, right? Like they know I'm not going to watch any film or I'm not going to watch any movies that have sexual immorality or nakedness or any of that kind of stuff. And if you don't have that conviction, you ought to get it, right? Especially in lieu of everything that we're saying here. We're going to put a profanity filter on the TV. We're not going to listen to the bad words and all that kind of stuff. And that's good. That's what you should do. But and this is my own justification. I'm talking about myself now. But I don't mind war movies, that was real life and all that kind of stuff too. And, certain sports and stuff can be awfully violent too. But violence is not of God. It really isn't. And so, we shouldn't take pleasure in the murders and the killings and the beatings and all the different kind of stuff. I mean, there's a part of me in my sinful flesh, I'll confess and I'll admit, that appreciates street justice when it's doled out in certain circumstances. That's not necessarily right. All right. And one of the characteristics that God is judging in the book of Genesis is violence. Okay. So while we're there, I wanted to make sure that we emphasize that. And he says in verse number 13, behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And he's going to do this, of course, as we know, by water. All right, look at verse 14. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. That gopher wood is some kind of a cypress or a cedar wood that could float and withstand water. And you only see this thing's really put together with wood and pitch. There is no iron, there's no copper, there's no brass. We kind of already emphasized that in previous lessons. It's made of wood. Wood, unlike those other minerals, was once alive. It's a picture of Christ. Something has to die for Noah to be saved. Understand? And those trees were once alive and no longer. This pitch, I think the Hebrew word that word pitch is translated from means or signifies atonement, but we're not going to get into that necessarily right now. But quite physically, it was like a gummy tar substance that was likely used for waterproofing, crack filling, that type of stuff. Look at verse number 15. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. So those are the physical dimensions of the ark. Does anybody know how long a cubit is, or how you would measure a cubit? That's exactly right. That's what you were going to say too, right? So you'd measure it from your elbow to the end of your fingers, and it's about 17 and a half to 18 inches. However, it could also be longer than that. Remember, there's giants in those days. Their arms are going to be longer. right? So it could be as much as 22 and a half inches. And so I think generally 18 inches is the number that I use whenever I look at a cubit and do any type of calculation for any types of physical dimensions, whether it be this, the tabernacle, the temple, all that kind of stuff. So if it's 18 inches, 300 cubits is 450 feet. It's 450 feet long. Okay, that is 1.5 football fields, right? Yep. And 75 feet high, 45 feet wide. If you go with 22 and a half inches as a cubit, then it's 562 long, 93 high, and 56 wide. Henry Morris has a good note in one of his books on how the animals could all fit into the ark. And this is what he says. I'm going to read you this quote. Assuming the ancient cubit was 17 and a half inches, the ark could have carried as many as 125,000 sheep-sized animals. Since there are not more than 25,000 species of land animals known, living or extinct, and since the average size of such animals is less than a sheep, it is obvious that all the animals could have been stored in half the capacity of the ark. With that 18-inch cubit, Dr. Ruckman estimates the ark had a capacity of 2.958 million cubic feet. This thing is huge. It's massive. Yes. Absolutely. Why would you bring a full-size mature animal versus a baby? How long are they on the ark for? They're going to be on there for about a year. All right. So they're bringing probably young animals, right? Old enough that they don't need to rely on a nursing mother or anything like that. They're self-sufficient, but not full grown. Remember, they're going to be sitting there feeding and caring for these things for a year. So they're likely mature when they come off, but not mature when they go on. All right. So, and there's more than 2 by 2 in a lot of these cases, and we'll talk about that here when we get into chapter 7 as well. So what I want you to understand is that it is very reasonable on the size and scale of this thing. And remember, as we'll look at the details here in just a moment, but there's 3 decks with chambers and rooms, or not rooms necessarily, but stalls or whatever you'd call them, where these things can be cared for. And, it's the size of that thing is pretty easy to fit not only all the animals, but a year's worth of supplies on that thing and have room for the human passengers to be able to live and get fresh air and all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that as we go through here a little bit more. Look at verse number 16. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the ark and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. So he, I don't know how he makes it, but he makes this exterior hull, right? And then he's putting 3 decks, 3 stories high. Remember, you got a total height of 45 feet, and you really have a window that's 18 inches. You see, it's a window-sized cubit that basically runs lengthwise for some distance, that basically is a whole window that goes around so that fresh air can come in and circulate in and out. And it's got a slanted roof basically over the top of that window to protect it from the rain and all of that other kind of stuff. So you got a lot of room. You got a lot of room. This divisions, these 3 stories, actually is reminiscent of the 3 divisions that show up in pretty much a lot of areas, but I'm going to talk about physical buildings here for the most part. In the tabernacle, you've got the outer court, you've got the holy place, and you've got the Holy of Holies. Inside that outer court, if you can picture it, maybe you can't picture it. Maybe we can illustrate it like this. If this is the outer court, right here, this is the tent that goes inside of it. That tent's divided in 2 places. What is this tent? It's a rectangular shape with an A-frame type roof over it, exactly the same as the ark. Okay, and so it's very much similar in that it also has those 3 compartments. The temple has those 3 compartments. There was 3 heavens, right? There was 3. The first, second, third. We saw them being made in Genesis. So again, threes showing up throughout the Bible. The nation of Israel geographically had the land of Galilee, the land of the Jordan, and then the Dead Sea area. It's broken up into three. All right. And then it also has a door that is set on the side thereof. And that, remember, the ark is a type of Christ. And so, as a type of Christ, what does that door in the side represent? There's two things. No, two things about Christ. All right, look at John chapter 10. There you go. There's one of them. He's pierced where? In his side. Okay. And then look at John chapter 10, verse 9. Excuse me. John chapter 10, verse number 9. Jesus is making a statement there about himself. He says, I am the door. Right? I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. Well, how do you get saved here? You got to go in through the door to the ark. Right? Very clear picture. Look at John chapter 19. John chapter 19, verse number 34. John 19:34. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came thereout blood and water. That Roman spear goes in through the fifth rib and literally breaks his heart, blows it apart. And blood and water, a picture of humanity and divinity, come pouring out. Great type of Christ. All right, go back to Genesis chapter 6. Look at verse number 17. All right. It says, and behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. So recognize a couple of things here. Number one, it's God that sends judgment, and he's using meteorology in a manner of speaking. Certainly this is a supernatural event, but he's using weather to do it. So when you see floods and you see hurricanes and you see earthquakes and you wonder, oh God, why? God's behind that thing. You know, there was a hurricane just a couple days ago. In fact, I think it was Sunday that pounded Puerto Rico, not with heavy wind, but with heavy rain. It knocked out power to the entire island. Didn't hear much about that on television, though. They did a couple years ago when there was a different president. But I'm just saying, I'm not going to get into that. But the entire island was being flooded. It dropped something insane, like 18 inches of rain. And then it was continuing on and going to the Dominican Republic. I didn't hear anything about what happened after that. And I don't know what's happening now, if they're saying that it's going to hit the United States or whatever. It's out to sea. Good. And I hope they all continue to do that. But the Lord makes those. The Lord makes those storms. In fact, there was actually a study once. I think it was Robert Militello, actually, who put it together years ago. It might not have been that. And it was a correlation between American foreign policy moves with respect to Israel, and then hurricanes that happened basically in that same amount of time period. And there was a time in 2005 where the Israeli government was bulldozing Jewish settlements and pulling the Jews out of their homes as a means to try to, pacify the Muslims. Within a month, I think it was, or a month or 2 months, was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. They were literally bulldozing Jewish houses, and literally the Jewish military had to pull Jewish settlers, basically pull them out of their houses kicking and screaming, and then they bulldozed them. And then that happened. And I'm telling you, I'm not going to get into a study on the correlation of those things, but that's not an isolated incident. There's been a lot of those types of things through history where God has used natural disasters as a chastising on America for our own allying ourselves with the enemies of Israel. Remember what God says in Genesis chapter 12, I will bless thee that bless, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. And that is 100% true today, just like it was when God said it in Genesis chapter 12, which we'll look at in a couple of months probably. All right, but back to back to Genesis. I say that thing about storms and natural disasters because you as a believer, you as a Christian, the very first thing you should do when you see or hear about some kind of horrible thing is you should pray and say, God, are you in this? And what are you trying to teach us? And you should intercede for your country. You should intercede for your family. You should intercede for whoever you need to in prayer. Say, God, we've sinned. God, please forgive us. God, be merciful to us. That's what this country needs. The answer to this country's problems will never be found at a ballot box. It will never be found in a law or in a regulation or in a movement of federal, state, or local government. It will only be found by a repentant nation crying out to God for mercy. That's it. But people today do not fear the God of the Bible, and they don't understand what he is doing and why he is doing it in the greater scheme of things. And they look at these things and they're like, oh, travesty, what are we going to do? Yeah, and I understand it is a human suffering, and we should try to help with that too. But the most important thing is to understand what God is trying to do. He's still working to try to bring this nation to repentance. Now, it might be too late, and it probably is, but we should still pray as though it's not. All right, he says he's going to bring floods of water upon the earth. And that's God pouring out his wrath on his creation because he is holy and he will not tolerate sin. God must punish sin. He created hell for the devil and for his angels, but he will just as surely send a sinner there as he'll send the devil there. It's as simple as that. It's a necessary aspect of his being. He's holy. He must punish sin. He can't not punish sin. Also, regarding this global flood, a lot of liberal Christian theologians and scholars and etc. will try to convince you that it was a local flood, that it was an extremely destructive flood, but only in a particular region, almost akin to what I just described happened in Puerto Rico in the mountains, or what happened in Indonesia with that tsunami some years ago. This is not a local flood. It's a global flood. It's going to destroy all flesh, as we see here. But one of the interesting proofs of this, in addition to all the geographical things that we'll probably talk about here in a moment, is that there are 11 ancient civilizations that recorded a great destructive flood, and that are not Bible-believing peoples by any stretch of the imagination. Sumerians, Babylonian clay tablets. In North America, there are 58 documented accounts, including the Navajo Indians, who believe that it formed the Grand Canyon. Of the 200 such legends, the most well-known is the Gilgamesh epic, which was written by the Babylonians. And if any of you have a copy of Haley's Bible Handbook, there's a lot more stuff documented in there about some of that evidence. Pardon me. Still dealing with this cough. It's really annoying. All right, verse number 18. But with thee, Noah, will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. Now, this is actually the first mention of the word covenant. When I teach dispensations and rightly dividing, this is actually the third covenant that I would emphasize or teach. But it is actually the first place where the word is used. And a covenant's an agreement. And so he does make a what we call the Edenic covenant in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. He makes the Edenic covenant in Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 through 19. There's a sign of those covenants. The Edenic covenant had a sign, which was the tree. The Edenic covenant had the sacrificed sheep or lamb, the skins that they were clothed in. And this one has a sign too. It's going to be the rainbow. And we'll see that come down in Genesis chapter 9. But what you have here is God establishing a covenant with Noah, the conditions of which basically are build the ark and get in it, like I said. Look at verses 19 and 20. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. they shall be male and female. Of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, two of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. Now, he brings them in both male and female. But what happens if one of those things come in there and says, I don't really feel like a male anymore? What are you going to do? What are you going to do with that? Yeah, those guys are still on the outside of the boat. Okay? So God makes very clear, definitive statements about gender and sexuality and all that kind of stuff. And I don't care what any politician or advocacy group has anything to say about it at all. All that is confusion. I don't care how much makeup a man puts on and how long he grows his hair and how nice of a dress he wears. He's still just a confused man. I've been researching confusion. I'm probably going to turn it into a message. Hopefully for the Sunday, but we'll see. I thought that last Sunday too, and it didn't happen. Are you guys aware? You know who Bruce Jenner is, right? He doesn't go by that name anymore. Ladies, I just want to get your opinion on something. So he decided after winning gold medals or whatever he won back yonder in men's athletic events that he just feels like a woman, and he is actually a woman, and he changed his name to Caitlyn. And our country celebrated him, and I think in his first year as a woman became Woman of the Year, right? How do you feel about that, ladies? He beat you all in his very first year. What is that? Come on. Never had a period. Never carried a child. You understand what I'm saying? He ain't a woman. He's just a confused man. And we are a confused society that treats him like a woman and accepts him as one. What's more perverse? The person who has something wrong with him that actually believes something that's not so, or all the quote-unquote sane people who walk around and treat him like it actually is so? Who's more deluded? Just saying. If aliens came down from another world, what would they think of us? Doesn't really matter. What does God think of all that stuff? He's destroying it right here and right now in Genesis chapter 6, and he's going to do it again real soon. All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to get all sidetracked down there. But one other thing I want to point out here is he's bringing in, look at verse 20, fowls after their kind, and a cattle after their kind. Now, if you look up one of the zoological pyramids, right? You got the animal kingdom, and then you got the phylum, and then you got this and that. You got 7 things. I think families are number 5. I forget what's after that. And then you got species at number 7. The word kind is actually not in there. And that is a deliberate act by unbelieving scientists to make it harder to accept the Bible. But I think kind generally corresponds to the family. It'd be the 5th level on the zoological hierarchy. He's not bringing in every species of bird, every species of dog, every species of kitty cats and all that other kind of stuff. But what he is doing is he's bringing them in by their kind. So there's cats, there's dogs, there's cows, there's deer, there's tigers, and there's all these different types of things, all right? And what he is also doing is he is bringing enough variety in those individual kinds to allow for, through crossbreeding and all that natural stuff that happens, the propagation of various species down through time. It's amazing that God made a creation. He does the same thing with people, by the way. You get all the races and people groups of the world descending from these 6 people, Noah's sons and wives and their wives. There's enough variability in the genetic code to create all of the diversity that you see in life today. God's creation is exceptionally detailed and capable of producing those types of diversity within species from what he saved on the ark. In fact, if you watch, I'd sent out many months ago when we first started Genesis a video that's free online called Is Genesis History? It's a Christian documentary about all the different disciplines of science that basically validate the biblical creationist model that you read about in the Bible. And one of the most interesting ones in there is the meetings with the zoologists and the marine biologists and all those types of guys. And they talk about the capability of like cats and all these different types of things to produce all that diversity. Because when you actually look at like a lion, a tiger, a panther, a lynx, and all this other, or just a common little kitty cat, they all basically have the same type of bone structure and anatomy and all that kind of stuff. So, you look at Garfield or Heathcliff versus like Lion King of the Jungle, and when you watch them move and how they behave themselves, although there's certainly differences, they're basically just cats. The amount of similarity is absolutely incredible. So anyway, if you've never seen that video, I do highly recommend it. It is a little dry, so I maybe would suggest watching it for 20 minutes, take a break, and then watch another 20 minutes. High HD too, like the Grand Canyon and all that other kind of stuff. It's spectacular. Really, really good. Highly recommend it. All right, but I also want you to look at chapter 7 here. Look at verses 2 and 3 and verse number 14 also. In verse 2 it says, "Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens." Remember I told you, not every animal is going on there with just 2. Some of them are going on there by 7s, the male and his female. And of beasts that are not clean by 2. So clean animals are going on by 7s. Unclean animals going on by 2. Now, what's one of the reasons why they need to be able to take on more clean animals than unclean animals? 2 things, really. One of them is they're going to sacrifice some of them. What's the other reason? Yeah, they're going to eat them. They're not allowed to eat the unclean animals, right? So you got to have some extra ones. You got to have some extra chickens, or you could keep them on the boat alive for 2 years. But then as soon as you get off, the family dog is going to get one of them, right, Josh? And then you're going to cook the other one up, fried chicken. So you did all that work for nothing, right? No, so they bring on extras. Some of them probably get off pregnant, frankly, and reproduction begins immediately, right? And so you have all that. All right, now look at verse 3. "Of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth." And then skip down to verse number 14. "They and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort." All right. And it's also likely, and again, it's maybe not relevant to this, but it's just interesting to think about. Remember, we talked about when we went through chapter 5 how long people lived? And Methuselah was 969 years old, and he was not the only guy who lived to 900 in that genealogy, right? How long do you think? Do you think animals may have been living a lot longer too? Why wouldn't they? All the same things that allowed for human flourishing during that time would have permitted animal flourishing as well. And the same would have been true of pre-flood plants and other things. Can you imagine what it would have looked like back then? So it is quite conceivable. Reptiles never stop growing. An iguana, if you let it live long enough, the thing will end up being like, a dinosaur. So when you look at some of these things that they dig up out of the ground and you say, wow, these are dinosaurs or something, whatever they are, I don't even know what they are or where they came from. I'm not going to even speculate on it. But it is very plausible that, without predators and all the other kind of stuff and the atmospheric conditions, you would have had some birds and you would have had some reptiles and some other creatures that were probably gargantuan in size. Just saying. Verse 21, "And take thou unto thee all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them." So they have enough food to last them a year. But here's the thing. God never tells them how long they're going to be on there. So they just got to stash as much as they can. Not just for themselves, but also for the animals. But at the end of the day, the Bible never says anything about this. But if you just think about it, God going to let those people starve? Absolutely not. He gave manna in the wilderness, right? When Jesus was there, he gave them manna in the wilderness. He fed the 5,000, all that kind of stuff. He's going to give them manna in the wilderness again in the tribulation period, in Psalm 74 and Revelation and all that, Matthew 24 and all that stuff. So somehow God was going to make sure that they had fresh water and they had, it wouldn't have been hard to get water, right? They're floating on it, right? But I'm sure they had some kind of a bucket system. But at the end of the day, God was going to keep these people supernaturally secure and safe in the ark. And again, what's the ark? It's a picture of Christ. Is there anything that you can do to lose your salvation? No. As long as you're in the ark, you're safe. He's gonna provide for them. But he does make them do all the things necessary to sustain life. They bring in food and water and supplies. In verse 22, thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. Now, Noah does what he is told to do. And if you look at chapter 7, verse number 5, and Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. He's a faithful man, and he's mentioned throughout the whole Bible in high esteem of God. His testimony is very similar to Moses, and that God was commanding Moses to do things, and he said Moses did all that the Lord commanded him to do. That's a great testimony. Here's my question for you. Is that your testimony? That's a great testimony right there. And that gives you a pretty good indication of why God gave Noah grace as opposed to, all the Caitlyn Jenners that were going on back in Genesis chapter 6. Why does God choose Abraham? Because he knew that he would direct his children after him. You'll see that later in Genesis also. Are you being faithful with what God told you to do? Noah did. And he should be our example for that because you're living in days that are just like his. All right, we'll stop right there and pick up chapter 7 next week. Does anybody have any comments or any questions or anything like that?